Union began as a way to build a new world from the ashes and ice. In the 3500s CE, negative 5500 U by Union's dating system, Earth sent the first wave of her children out to see the stars. The world, humanity's only home save for distant, fledgling colonies, was dying. An accumulation of fatal blows, 1,000 cuts on the world by the people that called it home, had rendered it all but inhospitable. The fall, as it is now called, was not concluded in a single cataclysmic blow. There was time. Not enough of it, but time enough for acts of desperate hope. The 10 were one such act. In the twilight of the fall, 10 massive colony ships launched from orbital shipyards that ringed Earth. They were slow ships, their titanic hulls pushed along by conventional sublight drives, but they marked the crowning achievement of a species, a second chance. These generation ships were humanity's last hope. They would travel for thousands of real-time years, accelerating nearly to light speed before flipping over and slowing down as they approached their destinations. Generations of passengers would live, die, and procreate, sustaining the ship and the remnants of humanity on board until they arrived at their destination, a world able to sustain human life. This was humanity's second chance, a handful of stones cast out into the night. Back on Earth, the billions left behind watched the 10 burn away into the night, tracking their progress through choking clouds of smog, dust, and smoke from raging, unstoppable wildfires. Humanity on Earth fought for what was left, erupting into a pandemonium, a violent crescendo. Climate change choked the atmosphere, disease scoured the cities, and war ravaged the rest. Lonely colony outposts and stations throughout the solar system, established when Earth was terminal and not yet dying, watched their homeworld go dark. Most withered on the vines, a rare few managed to hang on. Thousands of years of real time passed. For the 10 ships, relative time passed slower. Earth spun, silent and unresponsive to the desperate calls for help from her dying colony. Cities sank under rising water, wildfire and stinking fog swept the equator. The poles thawed, while storms thrashed the tropics. Ash fell over the whole of the world. Satellites and stations decayed in their orbits, shipyards fell quiet. Great habitats on the Moon and Mars cascaded into failure. Thousands more of years of silence followed. The first Anthropocene, the age of humanity, faded, buried under ash and water. Yet Earth was not empty, nor lost. Billions had died, but humanity is a resilient race. Some hundreds of thousands had survived, persevering through the new long dark. This was the fall, the end of it, and the beginning of a new dark age. In time, the global population began to stabilize, then grow as the world's climate evened out. Long-dead crops began to grow as hardy survivors. Trees, forgotten at the fall, grew back from gnarled shrubs. The oceans receded, cooled. The fires dimmed, then died. The sky, once a greasy smear of black and orange, lightened, blue. Humanity, too, began to grow back. First, small rulers and tyrants laid claim to the ruins of the past, organizing themselves around altars of scavenge and scrap. Wandering machines were tamed or followed, venerated and hunted. Farms grew from small plots. Once again, lines and borders were drawn, land claimed, loyalty pledged. Scraps of cloth and paint and feathers and flags grew to mean to divide. The rulers gave way to nations, nations to empires. And then, the first of the 3 great traumas humbled the healing world. Old vaults, stores of information from the pre-collapse era, were discovered and reopened. The survivors, so far removed from old humanity, had grown through the Dark Ages thinking that their cultures were the first on Earth, the first people to walk under the sun. They discovered otherwise. They were not the first. They were the last. Reeling from this discovery and the wealth of a pre-collapse humanity unleashed upon a healing world, the fledgling states of Earth backed into their corners. Ultimately, a reckoning followed the revelation, and a new war began, a global war. This was the second trauma. A global war, a bitter fight over the scraps of the long dead. War scarred the world, and when it was done, the survivors gathered together and pledged peace. The tools of war and capital were thrown aside, as they had nearly killed Earth again. Humanity pledged peace and came together under a single banner, which would be the last to fly over Earth. Union. Union's foundation reset the clock, changing the calendar and myriad dating systems to one single metric. Year Zero marked the beginning of a new age of humanity, a people redeemed, bruised stewards of an old and aching world. In peace, and with the help of the wondrous technology of their predecessors, the people of Union began to dream of greater things. Flight and clean power spread across the world. Linked, networked communication further bound Union together. Sudden exponential advancement in medications, computational power, hard and soft sciences, all gift from the data stored in seed vaults across the world. We discovered and translated the story of the collapse, of the desperate rush of old humanity to preserve what it could so that future generations could begin anew, with all the plenty and knowledge of those who came before. We found technologies that could have saved the world, but were discovered too late or kept from humanity by their inventors and owners. Union began to look beyond, out towards the depth of space. The first rockets were launched, and on Luna we found dusty colonies, empty but for mummified remains of the people who once lived there. We found dormant satellites strung in orbit, ancient shipyards hanging in space. We found charts, logs, flight plans, trajectories showing that some of us, some of our ancestors, had escaped. We found and thawed old telescopes, radio towers, and laser communication suites, preserved in ice on mountaintops and high places all over the world. We pointed them to the stars and turned them on, and waited. The first messages arrived almost immediately. This was Union's third great trauma. Ancient calls from distant, lonely outposts and hardscrabble colonies. Voices thousands of years old and long dead on radio waves garbled by radiation, time, and transit, crying out to their home for help. Lost souls that begged for aid, for guidance, for their loved ones. Thousands of years of messages recorded and playing on endless, decaying loops for the survivors to hear. This was the voice of humanity from the stars, a desperate cry for help, a lonely gasp as the air ran out, a plea, unanswered, as the light grew dim. Union had a new purpose, to answer these calls, and to ensure the events that caused them would never happen again. The old orbitals were taken and reactivated. Machine minds greater than humanity's, the first artificial intelligences, were discovered and set to puzzle out solutions we could not. The first new ships were launched towards those old signals, along ancient charted paths and out towards new worlds. Union could not bring their dead back home, but they could choke the stars with the living.